Hello and welcome to this week's Rights in Russia interview. I'm Mary Page, and today our guest is Grigory Vaypan. Grigory is a graduate of Moscow State University, Harvard Law School, and St. Petersburg State University. He has been a Galina Starovoitova Fellow at the Kennan Institute in Washington and has worked at the Institute for Law and Public Policy, which is a nonprofit based in Moscow, where he has been developing nonprofit jurisprudence related to human rights cases before the Russian Constitutional Court. In a recent report he wrote for the International Federation for Human Rights, which is based in Paris, it's entitled Russia's Crimes Against History. He notes that Russia is one of the countries that has passed the largest number of laws suppressing freedom of expression on historical cases. Currently, Grigory is one of the lawyers representing Memorial at the Russian Supreme Court in the lawsuit brought by prosecutors to close down one of Russia's leading human rights NGOs. Thank you for joining us, Grigory, and for sharing your considerable expertise on the situation for human rights defenders in Russia. So I have a series of questions to structure our half hour together. So if you're ready, let's get started.
I am, and thanks for having me.
Hey, great, thanks for being here. You've experienced legal education in both Russia and the US. Could you tell me something about the key differences you've noticed in approaches to legal education in the two countries?
I would say the two experiences were very different. Russian legal education is still pretty much about learning black letter law, learning cases, learning legal texts, legal codes, etc. Whereas in the United States, well, especially at Harvard, which is one of the top law schools in the world, the focus was less on substantive law rather than on skills, legal skills that a lawyer should have, and also on critical thinking. So for me, my time at Harvard was less about learning about new cases or about new legal texts, but rather it was a time of reflection and learning to look at familiar things in a different way. So, for example, I took a course on public international law, which was about human rights too, and it was the whole course was presented from the standpoint of critical legal theory, something I was pretty much unfamiliar with during my time at Moscow State University. So again, it was a time of reflection, and of course, it was a time of community building. US universities are known for bringing students from all over the world who share their experiences, who share their stories. So it was a very inspiring time,
Mm-hmm. And when was that? What were the years that you were?
It was 2012, 2013.
Uh-huh. So thinking back to Russia, many people say that the emergence of a cohort of dedicated human rights lawyers in the younger generation in Russia is one of the most exciting developments to have taken place in post-Soviet Russia. Would you agree?
Well, I would. In fact, I was an outlier when I was at university. So people of my generation, we are the first post-Soviet generation, and in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, most people were preoccupied with private well-being and personal growth. So at the time when I was a student, it was late 2000s. Most students would still go as graduates. When they graduate, would go to the private sector, to private law firms, and would serve their private clients. Would work in such areas as commercial law, private law, and public interest lawyering was at that time an exception. When I was 18, I volunteered to become an election observer. It was not as common as it turned out to be just years later. So for the past 10 years, I've watched the noticeable and considerable growth of interest, professional interest in public interest lawyering in Russia. So that young lawyers, recent graduates, are now eager to work in the human rights sector, are now eager to work work for nonprofits, despite considerable pressure from the government against independent actors in this field. So just to give you one example, when I was at the Institute for Law and Public Policy in 2016, I believe, we did a summer school on public interest law and strategic litigation, and it was for senior law students and recent graduates. There was a group of 20 to 25 students that we selected, and you know, the whole idea of that school was to provide some insights into the professional opportunities that the public sector offers here in Russia. It was difficult to predict how the graduates of that summer school would end up doing, but I was very pleased and surprised to see, just several years later, to see one of the graduates. I just received an email from the International Committee of the Red Cross inviting me to some event in Moscow, to the regional delegation of the ICRC, and the email was signed by one of the graduates of our summer school. So she ended up working as a lawyer, as a legal advisor for the Red Cross. That was a very welcome news for me.
Yes. And what drew you personally to public interest law when you were younger?
I think the primary reason was dissatisfaction with the way things were happening around me in my country. I mentioned my experience as an election observer. So the second time I went to a polling station, I was kicked out of the polling station by two police officers who were covering up electoral fraud, basically ballot stuffing. And then it was me and my friend, and we went to court to challenge the election results at that polling station. And we saw, instead of seeing a fair trial, we saw a sham trial. We saw a fake court. We saw fake witnesses who were giving false testimonies, and there was very little we could do about it. So I guess my experience, my ending up in public interest lawyering, was a result of that frustration with human rights, with governance in Russia in general, and that influenced me a lot.
You're one of the lawyers acting for Memorial in the current legal cases brought by prosecutors seeking to close down the organization. I won't ask you about that case, but I would like to ask about how difficult in general the legal environment is for nonprofits in Russia today.
It is very difficult, and the past 10 years have seen a dramatic increase in pressure from the government. The primary instrument of pressure and stigmatization here is, of course, the Foreign Agents Law, which Russia introduced in 2012. The Foreign Agent Law basically works as a deterrent to any organization that wants to be independent, because the only way to be independent is to not receive any funding from the government or any authorities, any structures affiliated with the government. And in the current Russian political environment, there are very few domestic donors who would be willing to fund the kind of independent work that, for example, Memorial does, because Memorial, it would suffice to say that 25% of all applications against Russia brought before the European Court of Human Rights has been brought by the Human Rights Center Memorial. So Memorial works, its work directly affects the government. It directly affects the government's reputation, because the Russian government loses most cases, in fact, almost all cases, before the European Court of Human Rights. So the government has quite efficiently enforced the Foreign Agents Law in the past decade. In fact, it has even tightened it. And NGOs who are independent are risking being any minute are risking being included into the list of foreign agents, which entails not only stigmatization, not only loss of any opportunities, any partnership opportunities with either the authorities or any state-affiliated organizations, including state universities, for example. But not only that, the foreign agent status means severe administrative and financial burdens for any NGO. It also means, most certainly, it means fines for non-compliance. The foreign agents law is very unpredictable. For example, all NGOs are required to label any publication or any websites that they are producing, but that requirement, that legal requirement, is in itself vague. It's not entirely clear which publications or which websites must be labeled. That's why all NGOs that are on the foreign agents list face enormous fines, and that in turn leads to the risks of closure or even forced liquidation, as we're now seeing with the case of Memorial. Memorial's case is the first case in Russia where an NGO is being shut down for alleged failure to comply with the Foreign Agents Act. So for the past decade, we've seen, the whole cycle, from the adoption of the Foreign Agents Law to now the first case where an NGO is practically being executed for being a foreign agent.
In its 2021 World Press Freedom Index, Reporters Without Borders placed Russia in the 150th position out of 180. So how would you characterize the state of freedom of expression in Russia today?
The space for free expression is shrinking. It's been shrinking for a while, and now it's even narrower that we could think of, that we could anticipate just 5 or 10 years ago. I already mentioned the foreign agents legal framework that applies to media as well, and an increasing numbers of media outlets and individual journalists have been labeled foreign agents, with all the consequences that I have described. But not only that, in fact, there are a series of laws that suppress free speech in Russia that have been adopted in the past years. Many people have already heard at least something about Russia's anti-terrorism or anti-extremism laws. There was a famous case against a Russian journalist, Svetlana Prokopieva, who criticized the authorities for their anti-terrorism measures, and she ended up being prosecuted under the charge of condoning terrorism. So she was doing her own analysis. She was doing her job as a journalist, discussing a terrorist attack, and she ended up being a convict herself. There are laws like the recent amendments that provide for severe punishments for something called public insult against the authorities, but something which is being used to prosecute and punish those who publicly criticize the government, criticize the authorities. And of course, Russia has been a pioneer of laws that suppress free expression on historical matters. Laws like the 2014 amendment to the criminal code that effectively prohibit calling into question the official narrative of the victorious Soviet Union in the Second World War is one example, but it's a very telling example.
Mm-hmm. Does it make a difference in what type of media people express their views? In other words, is it better to use the internet, to use newspapers? Is there a difference among those?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. But the trend is of course the government's tightening grip on the internet, because the internet has become a forum for and has for a while been a forum for a relatively free exchange of ideas and opinions. And that's why we've seen the tightening of legislation that purports to give the Russian authorities unrestricted censorship over what is being said or posted on the web. We've seen perhaps the most fascinating development in this sphere in the recent elections that took place in September this year, the parliamentary elections in Russia, where the authorities have done a great deal to shut down and to suppress the exchange of advice by opposition politicians such as Alexei Navalny as to parties and politicians people should vote for. So the so-called smart voting technique that was employed by the opposition, and the authorities went. They've deployed considerable force, including pressure exerted on foreign companies such as Apple and Google to make sure that Russian people do not receive those pieces of advice about who they should or should not vote for.
Mm-hmm. In 2020, the Russian Constitution underwent major changes. To what extent will these changes alter the role of the Constitution with regards to human rights? And to what extent does it change the role of the Russian Constitutional Court?
Well, I should start answering that question by saying that the Russian Constitutional Court itself validated those amendments in 2020 because the procedure, the ad hoc procedure that was provided for by the law, included an approval by the Constitutional Court, and the judges did that despite the fact that those amendments effectively overturned the entire constitutional foundation that was created back in 1993. We have the so-called inviolable provisions of the Russian Constitution in chapters 1, 2, and 9. Those provisions may not be amended other than by adopting a new constitution. But what the authorities did is they amended all the other chapters in the Constitution, chapters 3 to 8, in a way that subverted the basic principles that are still laid down in chapters 1, 2, and 9. So just to return to the example I gave before, free speech on historical matters. Indeed, in chapter 2, the human rights chapters, there is a provision that protects free speech, proclaims free speech and protects it. It provides also for the free exchange of ideas and opinions. But then in the newly in the amended constitution in 2020, the government introduced a new provision in a subsequent chapter that also now says that the government protects historical truth, and that same article of the Constitution proclaims that the Russian Federation is a successor to the Soviet Union, and that the government protects also the memory of the defenders of the fatherland. In combination, that serves precisely to restrict free speech on matters such as the role of the Soviet Union in the Second World War, including war crimes that were committed by the Soviet armed forces. So in that sense, it was legally speaking, it was quite an absurd amendment process that turned our constitution from a more or less coherent legal instrument into a patchwork of conflicting legal provisions that at the end serve not to reinforce human rights, but to further undermine them.
We understand that in Russia today, lawyers can come under severe pressure. For example, in the case of Ivan Sabronov, two of his defense lawyers, Ivan Pavlov and Evgeny Smirnov, have been forced to leave the country. How do you explain these extraordinary developments, and what do they mean for the legal profession in Russia today?
These developments are indeed extraordinary, and they just show that in an authoritarian country, No professional group, no social group is protected from government pressure and intimidation and even persecution. So it just so happened that lawyers were not the first on the persecution list. But by 2021, the government has already persecuted the opposition. It has persecuted the media, and at some point, lawyers were next. So what we see, the case of Ivan Pavlov is indeed one of the first. It's not the first case, but it's perhaps the most prominent and notable case of the persecution of lawyers in Russia, and it only means that lawyers, I mean, the legal community in Russia, should realize that the time has come and the government has come for them. And it's time for solidarity. Without solidarity, new lawyers would come would become subject to government pressure.
In the West, the media tends to be gloomy about human rights and the state of civil society in Russia. To what extent is that gloom and pessimism justified, do you think?
You know, it always looks worse from the outside. When I travel abroad and spend several weeks abroad, I start seeing Russia differently. It always looks more frightening, looks scarier. When you are inside, perhaps it's like the frog in the boiling water experience, but you kind of see opportunities. You start, because you stop to be just an observer, but when you're inside the country, you are a participant. You start looking for opportunities for action. So the question becomes, what can I do to change things? And well, in this particular area, what can I do to change the situation with human rights in Russia? So for an actor, for someone who's acting, it's not, you're not focusing on how gloomy it is. You're focusing on what can be done, who you can partner with to make sure it happens, how you attract support from the Russian people. So it's just a different perspective. Yes, things are getting worse, objectively speaking, but the resilience of the Russian civil society is outstanding. It's extraordinary. And the resilience of the Russian society in general is also extraordinary. Just have a look at the numbers of people who have signed online petitions, say, against the foreign agents law. More than 250,000 people have signed a petition against the foreign agents law. In just 2 weeks, more than 100 people have signed the petition against the forced dissolution of Memorial. People are donating money for civil society initiatives like Over the Info, for example. It's a civil society group that provides legal support to people who were detained by the police, including to people who are detained at the public gatherings, at the public assemblies. And the amount of funding that they are raising is extraordinary by Russian standards. So it depends on the perspective you're using. From our perspective, something can still be done, and we're doing our best to do it.
To what extent are you in touch with young lawyers outside of the large urban areas, outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, for example?
I'm trying to be in touch with them. Indeed, when I was at the Institute for Law and Public Policy, we did seminars, we did workshops for lawyers in the Russian regions, and I wouldn't say people there are less passionate or less committed. Sometimes they just what they just need is just training. So particular knowledge or skills, and they also need some inspiration, because in the regions, usually people feel much lonelier, especially if they do independent human rights work. There are very few of them, so they feel lonely. And just I witnessed that, you know, when they see that there are in fact it's a community, it's not just them alone, then they're inspired to continue their work.
So how do you see the future of human rights in the coming years?
The future depends on whether we talk about the nearest future or a more remote one. If we're speaking about the short-term future, it will be challenging. We will anticipate more human rights restrictions, more crackdown on the civil society. But in the longer term, I would rather be optimistic, because I see, as I mentioned, I see the kind of support that the civil society receives from the Russian people, and the kind of sympathy to the human rights work that Russian lawyers and activists do. So in the longer term, I would be optimistic, but would just add this caveat that it's not enough to be optimistic. We need to continue to do our human rights work, our legal work, to make sure that the situation becomes better.
Well, I'm glad to hear that somewhat optimistic view, and congratulations for continuing to do that legal work that's so important. I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time together. So thank you so much for spending the half hour with Rights in Russia and for sharing your insights on human rights and NGO law in the country. Best wishes, Grigory, for the upcoming holidays and for successful outcomes in the valuable work that you pursue.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you.
Good to see you again.
It was great seeing you.
Okay.